train's whistle tore through the thin mountain air, long and mournful, before vanishing into the folds of the Rockies. Miriam Blackwood sat still in the hard wooden seat, her gloved hands resting on a small leather satchel. The satchel felt heavier than it should. Its weight was not in the paper and cloth within, but in the truth she carried. Through the smudged window, Cedar Ridge appeared in fragments, the leaning roofs of false front buildings, a plume of chimney smoke curling into the pale October sky, and the red-gold shimmer of aspen leaves trembling in the wind. The platform loomed ahead, worn boards darkened with rain. She had been here before, at least in her mind, imagining Violet stepping off the same train 3 months earlier, smiling, unknowing. The train slowed. The hiss of steam rose like a warning. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf's howl braided with the wind, curling along the ridge before fading. Miriam closed her eyes. She thought of Violet's last letter, the one she kept hidden in her coat pocket, its ink blurred by her sister's trembling hand. "If anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident." The letter had arrived too late. When the conductor called the stop, Miriam stood, the satchel pressed close to her ribs. Her boots clicked against the platform, the sound swallowed quickly by the restless noise of the town wagon wheels on wet dirt, the jingle of a horse's bit, the distant slam of a saloon door. The air smelled of coal smoke, damp wood, and the faint metallic tang of the mines. No one met her. She had planned it that way. No smiles, no questions. She was not Miriam Blackwood here. She was Miss Miriam Ward, another mail-order bride come west in search of a new life. The main street stretched ahead, lined with storefronts half-shrouded in the misty drizzle. In the distance, a church bell tolled once low, deliberate, like the heartbeat of the town. She walked, counting the sound of her steps. Each one took her further from the world she had known and deeper into the one Violet had died in. As she passed the saloon, a man leaned in the doorway, his hat shadowing his face. His gaze followed her not with desire, but with the wary calculation of a man who knows strangers bring change. She kept her eyes forward. At the far end of town, the courthouse rose above the other buildings, its windows dark and unblinking. She had seen sketches of Judge Harrison Crane, handsome, composed, a gentleman's face carved from stone. But now she was told he was dead. A heart attack, they said. Her fingers tightened on the satchel. She didn't believe it. The rain began to fall harder, pattering on the brim of her hat, running in cool rivulets down her neck. A window above the general store creaked open, and for an instant, Miriam glimpsed the flicker of a candle flame and the shadow of a figure watching her. Then the curtain closed. She remembered the field hospitals of the war canvas tents shuddering in the wind, the scent of carbolic and blood, the way death could slip in quietly and leave without ceremony. Cedar Ridge felt the same. Something here was rotting beneath the surface, and the rain could not wash it clean. At the boarding house, she paid for a small room with a window overlooking the street. She unpacked only one thing, a photograph of Violet in her wedding dress, her smile gentle, her eyes alight with the hope of a future she never got to see. Miriam set it on the windowsill and stood watching the town through the wavering glass. Somewhere out there was the truth. Somewhere out there was the man or men who had taken Violet's life and wrapped it in lies. And if they thought Miriam Blackwood would leave without finding them, they didn't know her at all. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet pine from the mountains. The church bell tolled again, and this time she counted the seconds after it stopped. The silence felt like an answer she wasn't ready to hear. She closed the window, but the sound of the rain stayed with her, steady and patient, as if it knew it would be here long after she was gone. The rain did not stop through the night. It tapped the tin roof above Miriam's narrow bed, a slow, patient rhythm that kept her from sleeping. She lay staring at the ceiling, thinking of the courthouse windows dark, watchful until the gray light of dawn bled into the room. Cedar Ridge woke the way wounded men did on a battlefield, slowly, with groans and the faint smell of smoke. From her window, she watched wagons creak down the muddy street, their wheels leaving deep scars in the earth. Somewhere a blacksmith's hammer began its steady ring, like a heartbeat made of iron. She dressed in silence, pulling on her boots and shrugging into her coat. The letter from Violet stayed in her pocket, close enough to feel. She stepped into the street, boots sinking half an inch into the mud, and made her way toward the only place she knew might hold answers, the doctor's office. The building sat at the edge of town, a narrow clapboard structure with its paint peeled by years of wind. The front porch sagged under its own weight. A faded shingle swung above the door. Nathan Cross, physician and surgeon. Inside, the air was heavy with the bitter tang of laudanum and the faint sweetness of dried herbs. A man sat behind the desk, head bowed, a pen unmoving in his hand. His coat was worn at the elbows, his hair a little too long, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and bad choices. "You're new in town," he said without looking up. His voice was rough, not from disuse, but from too much whiskey, too much smoke, and too many words swallowed instead of spoken. "I am," Miriam answered. She stepped closer, her boots scuffing the floorboards. "I'm told you treated Judge Crane before he died." That made him look at her. His eyes were gray, stormlight gray, and there was a flicker there, quick as a match strike, before it vanished. "That depends on who's asking." She met his gaze without blinking. Someone who knew Violet Blackwood. The name hung in the air like a shot that hadn't yet found its target. Cross leaned back, his chair creaking. He didn't ask how she knew Violet, didn't offer condolences. Instead, he studied her as if measuring the weight she carried. "Heart attack," he said finally. "That's what they wrote down," but he let the word trail off, like the end of a trail disappearing into fog. Sometimes the body tells you a different story. Miriam heard the unspoken part. She had seen enough men die to know when death came naturally and when it was hurried along. "You think he was poisoned," she said. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and crossed to a cabinet, his limp barely noticeable until he moved. He pulled out a small glass bottle, its label worn blank, and set it on the desk. "Arsenic leaves a mark," he said quietly. "In the eyes, in the lining of the stomach, but you have to be looking for it." He tapped the bottle. "Most men don't." Outside, a horse snorted, and the sound of boots on the porch made Miriam glance toward the door. Cross didn't move. Whoever it was passed by, their steps fading into the rain. "I can help you," he said at last, "but if we do this, we do it quiet. In Cedar Ridge, truth is a dangerous thing to carry." Miriam nodded once. The rain beat harder against the windows, streaking the glass until the street outside was only a smear of gray and shadow. She thought of Violet again, her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she'd never walked away from a fight worth having. Miriam's fingers tightened around the satchel strap. The silence between them stretched until Cross broke it. "Meet me after sundown. The Crane Ranch. Back door." She turned to leave, the wooden floor creaking under her boots. The smell of laudanum clung to her as she stepped into the cold air. The street was nearly empty now, just a stray dog nosing in the mud and the sound of water dripping from a saloon awning. Miriam pulled her coat tighter. The truth was closer now, close enough to see its shape in the shadows, but it carried the same weight as a drawn revolver. Somewhere behind her, the church bell tolled once. And in that single hollow note, Miriam heard the promise that before this was over, more than one grave would be dug in Cedar Ridge. The rain had thinned to a mist by nightfall, but the ground still carried the day's weight soft, sucking at her boots with every step. Miriam kept to the edge of the road, where weeds brushed her coat and hid her shape from anyone watching from town. The Crane Ranch sat like a shadow at the far end of the valley. The main house was 2 stories of dark timber, its windows unlit, the roofline sharp against the pale glow of the clouds. No lanterns burned. The place looked abandoned, but Miriam knew better. Her breath came slow, controlled. Each inhale carried the damp scent of pine and the faint sweetness of rotting hay. Somewhere far off, an owl called once and then was gone. She thought of Cross's limp as he had walked to the cabinet, of the way his fingers curled around the arsenic bottle. She thought of Violet, too, her handwriting shaky in that final letter. It had been more than a warning. It had been a hand reaching from the grave. The closer she drew to the ranch, the more the silence pressed in. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Miriam stopped once, crouched low in the weeds, and let her eyes adjust to the dark. A single shape moved by the corral, just a horse, pale in the gloom, its head bowed over a trough. The soft clink of its bit carried on the air. The back door was ahead, a small shadow within the greater shadow of the house. She stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. The smell hit her first, not the sweet, clean smell of pine boards, but something older, like cold ashes, and the faint metallic tang of blood long dried. Her hand found the doorknob. Cold. She paused, the night settling heavy around her. A memory surfaced half a lifetime ago, in a field hospital outside Vicksburg. She had stood with her back to a tent flap, listening to the rattle of a soldier's breath, knowing he would not live until dawn. She had hesitated before stepping inside then, too. Some doors, once opened, never let you back into the life you knew before. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint creak from inside the house. Miriam felt it in her bones. She was not alone. The mist thickened, softening the edges of the corral, the fence, the earth itself. She stepped inside. The air was still, heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding in secrets. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped a slow, patient rhythm that matched the beat of her own heart. Her boots made no sound on the floorboards. The darkness swallowed her shape, her breath, her name. And in that silence, she understood the truth about Cedar Ridge. It wasn't the storms, or the guns, or the lawless men that made it dangerous. It was the quiet, the kind that could hide anything. The house smelled of dust, old wood, and something else, something faint but metallic, like a coin held too long in the hand. Miriam stood still in the dark, letting her eyes adjust. The faint glow from a shuttered lantern in the kitchen drew her forward, each step groaning through the silence. Nathan Cross emerged from the shadows near the back stairwell, his limp more pronounced in the dim light. He held the lantern low, its weak flame throwing his face into hard planes of light and shadow. Without a word, he turned and led her deeper into the house. The rooms were cold, as if the walls themselves had forgotten warmth. Every object, every chair, every rug seemed heavy with the presence of a man who had ruled this place. A framed portrait of Crane stared down from the hallway, his painted eyes catching the light in a way that made them seem almost alive. Miriam felt the weight of those eyes on her back as Cross pushed open a door at the end of the hall. Inside was a study, the air thicker here, carrying the scent of tobacco and something sour whiskey gone stale. The desk was massive, carved from oak, the surface cluttered with papers, an inkwell, and a revolver that gleamed dully in the lamplight. Cross went to the wall behind the desk and knelt. His hands moved quickly, practiced, until a faint click sounded from behind the wood paneling. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small safe. Miriam stepped closer. The metal door was already ajar. Inside lay a collection of objects that did not belong together. A folded lace handkerchief, a hair comb with missing teeth, a gold wedding ring, and a neat stack of photographs. She reached for the top photograph. The edges were worn, the surface smudged. Violet, standing in front of the courthouse steps, smiling in her wedding dress. Miriam's chest tightened. Beneath it, another photograph, this one of a woman she did not know. The next, another, and another. Each face different, each smile frozen, and each photograph marked on the back with 2 dates, the day of a wedding and the day of a death. Her hands trembled as she set the stack down. The safe still held more, a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with Crane's tight, slanted handwriting. Names, dates, notes written in shorthand. There was no poetry to the words, only a cold accounting of lives ended. A floorboard creaked overhead. Both she and Cross froze. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Someone else was in the house. Cross set the lantern down and motioned toward the door, but Miriam's eyes were locked on the safe. She knew they couldn't carry it all, not tonight. The ledger, the photographs, the small tokens of the dead, these were truths that could break Cedar Ridge open, but truths had a way of getting buried again, if the wrong hands found them first. Another step above them. Then silence. In the quiet, Miriam could hear her own heartbeat, steady but hard, like a drum before a charge. She took one last look at Violet's face in the photograph, memorizing every line, every shadow, and slid it into her coat pocket. If someone was upstairs, they would have to leave now. Cross killed the lantern, and the dark swallowed them whole. They moved like shadows through the house, each step chosen, each breath measured. Miriam's fingers brushed the wall to keep her balance in the dark. Cross was just ahead, his limp muffled, the sound almost lost to the soft drip of water somewhere deep inside the walls. The creak came again from above, but fainter now, as if whoever was up there had stopped listening and started moving away. Miriam didn't trust it. In her time on the battlefield, the quietest moments had often been the ones right before the blood. The back door opened with a slow moan of wood, letting in the cold night. Mist rolled through, curling around their boots. Outside, the world felt wider but no safer. They stepped into the yard, boots sinking in mud that sucked and let go with reluctant squelches. The corral was empty now. The pale horse was gone. Somewhere far off, a coyote's cry split the air, sharp and lonely. Halfway to the fence line, Cross stopped dead, his hand lifted, signaling silence. Miriam followed his gaze. A figure stood under the cottonwood tree near the barn, still, watching. The moon broke through the clouds just long enough to carve the edges of her face, dark hair plastered to her cheeks with rain, eyes sharp but not hostile. Elena Vasquez. Miriam had never seen her before, but something in the woman's posture spoke of someone who had been waiting not for minutes, but for years. Elena stepped forward, her boots making no sound in the wet earth. She stopped within a few feet, close enough for Miriam to see the lines of grief and defiance etched deep into her face. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The rain hissed in the grass, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wet leather and wood smoke. Miriam felt the weight of the photograph in her coat pocket, the image of Violet pressing against her ribs like a loaded round. The woman's gaze flicked across, and something unspoken passed between them, a history Miriam didn't yet know. Cross's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Elena's eyes returned to Miriam, searching, measuring. In that silence, Miriam could almost hear the question the woman wasn't asking. How much do you know? A gust of wind rattled the barn doors. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled low and far. Miriam thought of Violet again, and of the ledger in the safe, its pages heavy with names. She thought of the footsteps on the floor above them, the way the darkness had seemed to breathe inside that house. She knew, standing there under the cottonwood, that whatever this woman carried, it was tied to the same noose that had taken her sister. The three of them stood in the rain, bound by secrets none were ready to speak. And as the clouds closed over the moon, plunging them back into shadow, Miriam understood. In Cedar Ridge, even allies came with blood on their hands. And as the night swallowed the last of the light, Miriam knew that in this town, the line between salvation and damnation was drawn in the same mud she stood on. The rain eased into a thin drizzle, but the ground beneath the cottonwood stayed soft and black, swallowing the sound of their boots. The three of them stood in a loose circle, the space between filled with nothing but the hiss of wet leaves and the faint scrape of wind against the barn siding. Elena's eyes were the color of burnt coffee, dark, bitter, and unflinching. When she finally looked away, it was not out of shame, but because she was sifting through memories too heavy to carry all at once. She moved toward the barn, slow and deliberate, and they followed. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp hay and old iron. A single lantern hung from a beam, swaying just enough to make the shadows lean and stretch like restless spirits. Elena stopped by an empty stall, her hand resting on the wood rail. For a long moment she stared at the dirt floor, as if the words she was about to speak were buried somewhere beneath it. Her voice came low, like a confession whispered in a church without a priest. Maria was 7 when the fever took her. The name hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Miriam didn't need to ask who Maria was. The grief in Elena's tone drew the lines clear. She was all I had left, Elena went on. After that, he had nothing to hold over me. But by then, she stopped, and the silence filled the gap, heavier than words. Miriam could see the rest without it being said. Years of fear, of looking away, of helping bury the truth in shallow graves because a child's life hung in the balance. Elena turned to face them, and in the shifting light, the hard planes of her face seemed carved by wind and time. Your sister tried to warn others, she said, her eyes settling on Miriam. I told her to leave. She wouldn't. And now, the sentence trailed off into the rafters. The lantern hissed as a drop of rainwater found its way down from the roof. Cross shifted his weight, his boots grinding into the dirt. There was something in his face Miriam hadn't seen before, pity maybe, or the echo of old debts unpaid. Elena reached into her coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She set it on the rail and unfolded it, revealing a silver hairpin, a crumpled letter, and a tarnished locket. These were hers, she said simply. The locket swung in the lantern light, catching just enough of the glint to make Miriam's chest tighten. She recognized it from a photograph. Violet had once sent proof that even in this land of dust and gunpowder, her sister had carried a piece of home close to her heart. The drizzle outside turned to wind, rattling the barn doors in their frame. Elena wrapped the items again, slower this time, as if each fold sealed away another piece of herself. When she looked up again, there was nothing soft left in her gaze. If you want the truth, you'll have to be ready to stand where he stood. And that's not a place you walk away from unchanged. The wind pressed harder against the barn, and Miriam thought of the safe, the ledger, and the footsteps overhead. She thought of Maria, of Violet, and of all the names in Crane's hand that had been turned into dates. For the first time she wondered if finding justice would feel anything like winning. The wind had carried the rain east by morning, leaving Cedar Ridge under a washed-out sky, pale as old parchment. The ground steamed where the sun touched it, giving the air a faint metallic tang like iron left too long in the weather. Miriam rode with Cross into town, the hooves of their horses striking wet earth with a slow, stubborn rhythm. Behind them, the valley stretched wide and empty, save for the thin ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney of Elena's small cabin. They did not speak on the ride in. Words seemed too brittle for what they carried. Miriam felt the weight of the photograph in her coat pocket, the edge digging into her ribs with every sway of the saddle. The church stood at the far end of Main Street, its steeple a splinter against the pale sky. The double doors were open, but no voices drifted out, only the faint smell of candle wax and cold wood. Inside, Reverend Samuel Matthews knelt at the altar, his hands resting on the open Bible. His black coat hung loose on his frame, as if the man himself had been hollowed out. He looked up when they entered, and in his eyes was something Miriam recognized from the battlefield, a man who had already made peace with his own damnation. Cross stayed by the door. Miriam walked forward, her boots sounding loud against the plank floor. The preacher closed the Bible gently, as if not to wake it. "I suppose you've come for the truth," he said, his voice worn thin, like rope frayed by too many storms. Miriam stopped a few feet from him. She didn't answer. Matthew's gaze shifted to the small crucifix hanging above the altar. "Crane was a serpent in a man's skin," he said. "I tried to save those women with prayer, with warning. It wasn't enough. So when Violet came to me," he paused, the lines on his face deepening. "She told me everything, every name, every grave. I knew there was only one way left." He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small glass vial. The liquid inside caught the light like molten silver. "Arsenic," he said simply. "Enough to stop a man's heart in one swallow. I poured it into his whiskey bottle the night before he died." Miriam felt the room shrink around her. There was no pride in his confession, no triumph, only the calm weight of a man who had chosen his road long ago and never expected to return. "I didn't do it for vengeance," Matthews said. "I did it to end the counting, to keep another bride from wearing black before her wedding dress had time to fade." Outside, a horse whinnied, the sound sharp against the heavy silence. Cross shifted by the door, his eyes fixed on the floor. Miriam thought of the ledger, of the photographs, of Elena's warning in the barn. Justice here was not clean, not written in law. It was shaped by the hands of those willing to break it. Matthews set the vial on the altar. "Do what you came to do," he said. "Tell the law, tell the papers, I'm ready." But Miriam didn't move. She looked at the man before her and saw both a savior and a killer, and in this town they often wore the same face. The wind slipped through the open doors, carrying the smell of rain and dust, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The church was cold, its walls breathing faint drafts of mountain air through gaps in the wood. Miriam stood near the altar, the smell of candle wax mixing with the dry scent of old hymn books. Cross lingered by the door, his hat in hand, eyes lowered. Matthews sat on the front pew, his coat folded beside him. When he finally spoke, it was as if the words had been carried a long way before reaching her. "Crane was a serpent in a man's skin," he said, voice low. "I prayed for a way to stop him. None came. Then your sister walked in here and told me every name, every grave, every lie. I knew what I had to do." From his pocket, he drew a small glass vial. The liquid inside caught the dim light like tarnished silver. "Arsenic. Enough to end him in one swallow. I poured it into his whiskey the night before he died." There was no pride in his tone, no triumph, only the calm weight of a man who had long made peace with the gallows. "I did it to stop the counting, to make sure no other woman would wear black before her wedding dress had time to fade." The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the faint rattle of the wind against the stained glass. Then the church door opened. Elena Vasquez stepped inside, rain clinging to her coat, her dark hair plastered against her face. She looked at Matthews, then at Miriam, and in her eyes there was no hesitation, only the resolve of someone who had come to settle a debt. They stood in the aisle, three shadows thrown long by the candlelight. "I was his daughter," Elena said, her voice flat, steady. "And I helped hide his sins. I told myself it was for Maria, but she's gone. Now there's nothing left to protect but the truth." Her eyes went to Matthews. "You did what I couldn't, and they'll hang you for it. Maybe Cross, too. That ends tonight." From inside her coat, she took a folded letter and set it on the altar. Miriam could see her own name written in the opening line, though her hands had never touched it. "It's my confession, true enough to damn me and clear you both." Matthews shook his head. "Elena." She silenced him with a look. "I've carried the weight of his life. I can carry the weight of his death." Without another word, She turned and walked out into the rain. Miriam didn't follow. There was a finality in Elena's steps that said she had already crossed a line no one could call her back from. Hours later, the knock came at Cross's door. A boy from the livery stood there, hat in hand, by the fence at her place. He said quietly, "She's gone." The frost still clung to the grass when they buried Elena behind her cabin. No preacher, no hymns, only the scrape of shovels and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Miriam placed a small stone at the head of the grave. Cross stood a few steps back, his hands deep in his coat pockets. Back in town, the church bell tolled once, calling people to the square. A makeshift memorial had been set, candles, a few flowers, and the names of women who had come to Cedar Ridge with hope and met only the cold earth. Violet's name was there, carved into a plank of pine. The townsfolk stood in silence. No speeches, no lawmen, just the quiet acknowledgement that a shadow had passed and left its mark. Miriam touched the satchel at her side. Inside, the ledger and photographs from Crane's safe rested like coiled snakes. She knew what they could do, destroy what was left of Matthews and Cross, or burn away the last traces of Crane's legacy. When the candles burned low, she saddled her horse. The road to Denver stretched east, long and pale under the winter sun. Somewhere ahead were men in black coats who still believed in the law and presses that would print the truth if given straight. She looked back once, at the cluster of buildings crouched against the wind. Cedar Ridge would remember its dead, and maybe, in time, it would learn to live without fear. With a squeeze of the reins, she turned east.